And we are live. And this is a special LinkedIn Live because it is White Ribbon Day. And for those of you who don't know what White Ribbon Day is, it is a day where men and boys across the UK commit to ending violence against women and girls. It's not a day of blame and or shame. It's really a day of honesty, accepting responsibility and choice. So I've corralled my friends here today to come and be part of the conversation. But this year's theme is men making the difference. And so my three friends here are men making a difference. Whether I've had to slightly corral them into on this mission with me, I don't know. I'll leave it to you to decide. But I am very grateful for you all stepping up and stepping in and being supportive of this initiative and being part of the men's voice, really, because that is what matters in the end. And certainly when we ran our Women's Voices event a couple of weekends ago, that came loud and clear. Women wanted to know that there were more men, as allies. But I also recognise that, and this again came out, that men suffer a level of, I don't know, call the word anxiety about, is that too much? Lack of understanding and all the rest of it. And I guess that's part of tonight's conversation. So anyway, without further ado, it's lovely to have you here. Thank you for joining me, guys. How are we?
Here, Laura. Yeah, really delighted to be able to take part in this. And that bit at the end there that you said, I completely get that, because I remember when you first put this to me and Mark to come and join you for Together as Allies, and we both went, "Ooh, what?" Us?
Particularly as I asked you to come on, International Women's Day as well, which
you're like, really? Is it us you want to hear from? And actually, yeah, it is, right? Because it's not all men, it's not me, Gov. Just doesn't fly anymore, does it? It just doesn't fly. It's not solving the problem, right? So we've got to, first of all, accept and understand our privilege and the privileged position we are in, and then ask ourselves the question, what can I do? Not, it ain't me, look over there, go blame him, go sort that out. I'm not violent, I don't do it. But actually, it's on us. It's on us to create a safer world, a world where there isn't violence, right? Because the vast majority of people, that's what we want. So we can't sit around waiting for somebody else to do that for us, right? We've got to take personal responsibility. We've got to ask ourselves, okay, perhaps I'm not the problem, but can I be the solution? What can I do? Let's start listening. Let's start listening to the women in our lives. What can we do to make you feel safer? What can we do to change our environment, to change our communities? What can we do to flush this out and make it a non-starter, something that we're just not going to accept?
And I think, you use a critical word there, Dan, listening. And I think look, we don't know what we don't know. And I think listening is a critical part of this. And there's so many things. And Mark, you did a brilliant post about the privilege of going out to the beach to effectively see the sunrise, but it was dark when you went out, and that was a privilege for you because you didn't have to think of all what Professor Fiona Vera Gray talks about, safety work, all this sort of thinking around, checking, sort of hypervigilance ultimately. And I think that's the thing is we don't know what we don't know. So unless we listen and understand, the different perspectives, and it's not even the extreme violence. I think one of the things that was loud and clear from the Women's Voices conversation was actually some of the smallest things that actually make women feel unsafe. And it's just acknowledging those. And I think it comes back to, as I say, Mark's post about the privilege of being able to, walk down to the beach and not think about, the fact that it's dark. And so I guess to that point, Mark, when I say, men making the difference, what comes to mind when you think about that for you?
I suppose I listened to your short interview with Vera, I can't remember her name already.
Fiona Gray.
Fiona Vera Gray. Yes, that's right. Fiona Vera Gray. Very, very interesting. And what really struck me was when she did the research with the women and got them to record what they were doing around safety and how they were surprised they had less incidents where they felt unsafe or where they suffered sexual abuse. But then in that surprise, they realized the length of safety they were going to, the techniques they were employing, the hypervigilance, as you said it. And I suppose that thing on the beach, right? When we go down, so I was down the beach. I must have been about 5:45 this morning, right? It's pitch dark. Okay, you can't see. Hence my video. Like I try to find there's some light because there's no light. Like, it was a dark night. There was no moon either. And there was a morning about a month ago where I was on the beach in the dark, and next thing, this giant creature came out of nowhere, bounding out of nowhere. I was like, what the? And it was a big, big dog. And eventually its owner caught up with the dog, and it was a woman, right? But she wasn't on her own. She had a huge, and this dog was huge. I didn't know what animal was coming for me at that time in the morning because the mind was playing tricks, And I suppose it's, and I've had those conversations with my wife, because I often said, oh, she wants to go for a walk. I was go for a walk. Like, what's just the problem? You go walk around where we are. There's loads of street lights. She goes, yeah, but it doesn't matter. Somebody could just grab you from outside, from the edge of a house. There's so many, she said there's so many dangers, and it's back to that point where we're arguing, what dangers? What are you talking about? There are no dangers, but I don't see the dangers. I don't see, my perspective is not attuned to what's there, which is what I was thinking about on the beach. I was thinking about, God, what dangers are there actually out here? What could be dangerous? If I was a woman, how would I feel about being in this space? And I wouldn't be in that space, and I'd be right not to be in that space, because for the chances of something happening may be minimal, but they still aren't zero. They still aren't, in fact, 1%. They're probably much higher than that. And that's the terrible thing. So what do we do is it's up to us to talk about it. Like, so we have to have this conversation, hence I put that post out there going, this is not a fun post. And even I had thought it was necessary to define what violence is, because we associate violence with being physical. We associate it with being sexual, but it's so much more than that. It's verbal, it's psychological. Like, financial really struck me, and I don't know if I left that on it because I thought it nearly needed explanation. And financial violence, and it's like, okay, right, so it's denial of access to money, and we all can look at Jesus. There's so many stories about that I can tell you from Irish culture where the man got paid, or from English culture where the man got paid and gave the woman a certain amount of money to run the house, and he took the rest of the money, and that kind of thing. Like, so it's very interesting how it spans across so many spaces. And I think it begins with us becoming aware of, well, what have I done here? Where have I actually been violent towards women in some way, shape, or form? And it is denying the reality. Like the conversation with my wife, is denying that reality. Is that a form of violence? Is that aggression? Is that, you're wrong because it is safe, because I feel safe? So really, I think it starts with us really challenging ourselves, Laura, and saying, what are we in this space? What have I done in this space to date? So therefore, what can I do differently tomorrow?
And that's a really good point. And I think the point about, the financial abuse is, it's one that, again, really came through, sort of economic and, social standing as well. That made people feel really or women feel really unsafe, and how some talked about effectively abandonment post-divorce, for example, and how that had made them feel unsafe, and actually it has all been almost this kind of power struggle almost. But taking that one stage further, Matt, you are raising two young children, and and I know you talk about your determined young daughter who's determined to be fiercely independent, and I know you say that scares you at times, but I guess what are you noticing differently as somebody kind of really close to community, and obviously you're around younger children within the district, especially because of the young children that you have. What do you kind of see within this field, or this field?
I guess with my daughter, I see a naivety that shouldn't be considered as such. It should just be a privilege that everyone should have. And my daughter doesn't see that, ooh, that might not be safe, or ooh, she shouldn't do that. And she's quite right. There shouldn't be a problem. But there is, and I feel it as a parent, and I know that my wife feels it as a woman from her own perspective, let alone thinking about our daughter. And it's sort of tapping into this awareness. That's something that being a father has enabled for me, because as Dan said right at the start, you know, I think my going in perspective was, well, I'm not a violent person. It's not me. Nothing to do with me. I'm not an issue here. But then you realize that that's just continuing to perpetuate the problem by sort of denying and not doing anything. And now suddenly as a father, I want to provide protection and I want to create a safer space. But also, it's also failing to recognize what I am doing. So I'm not a violent person. I would never raise a hand or anything, but I have to look at myself and say, have things that I have said or done in the past made a woman feel unsafe? And I have to say, now, as I reflect back on it, yes. Now I can protest and argue against that and say, well, I didn't mean that. That's not what I mean. I come from a good place. You know, anything that I've done has been well-intentioned or fun or whatever the situation was that I'm thinking of. Or I can start to recognize that I need to listen and hear that that's made someone feel unsafe, and be curious. I think we mentioned the word curiosity before, and use that information to change my behaviors and also my responses. So, you know, I know that my son could have heard me previously saying to my wife, when she says, oh, don't go into the park at night to walk the dog, me going, what? Oh, it's ridiculous. And then if my son hears me be so dismissive, that embeds one message with him. Whereas if I actually change my narrative and want to understand why there has to be this hypervigilance, why there's a fear of the park at night when I, as a privileged man, don't feel it, simply reflecting that back with her, if my son hears it, can make a difference. But yeah, I mean, as I say, the privilege of being a parent of a daughter who is so brave and fearless does make me want to look at and question and rethink certain sort of prejudices that I might have had in my mind. So yeah, it's a game changer.
You know, and I think something that kind of I'm hearing in what you're saying is, and the thing that springs to mind is this phrase, the meaning of the communication is the response you get. And that, you know, so we always think that we're communicating in a way that is, you know, above reproach, you know, most of the time. But actually, we can never know how another person is interpreting it. So if the response is defensive, then the way that the communication has been felt by that other person doesn't mean, therefore, it's been communicated in a way that is meaningful for them. And so, as I say, the meaning of the communication is the response that you get. And so, you know, we might think that we're doing it from a good place. And this is women as well. Look, you know, we always come to a situation with a lens based on the experiences that we've had in our world. So, but I think, you know, you're absolutely right, Matt, is that continual curiosity prepared to actually recognize, well, you know, I didn't quite get the response that I'd expected. You know, what didn't quite happen there? Well, you know, where didn't it land correctly? What could I do? And it's kind of that constant desire to learn more, to be more curious, to keep moving forward. I'm just going to go back to, because Graham's actually, who is going to deliver the active bystander training later, he's just kind of popped on following your comment, Mark, about denial. And he's shared denial is a good term to use here. It reminds me of the denial stage around genocide. And, I think there is the piece around denial and whether, we are truly acknowledging it. I don't know whether, Mark, you want to kind of chip back into that point, given, it was you who raised it in the first place.
Well, it was to the point that the professor made in our conversation with yourself, and it was, Adam, you came up here in the conversation we had a couple of months back around the upskirt kind of issue, and it was brought to school, and the school, school more or less denied the reality of the girl who had experienced the problem, and therefore and she made such a good point, the professor made such a good point about how, which is why women are silent, because the onus is on them to avoid being raped. The onus is on a woman to avoid being sexually abused, and therefore if it happens, it's her fault. So we're denying their agency in all of this. I think it's a huge, and there's the cultural shift that needs to happen, right? Because that school would be a perfect example. Oh, leave the boy alone, do you know what? This is a story that's probably relevant to where we are now. This came up only in a conversation the other day with a group of people I was with. There's a story in Ireland many years ago where a bishop was taken down for a better reason than normal. Was taken down because he had a child out of wedlock, right? And he was lauded, he was the bishop who met the Pope, and the Pope was in Ireland. He was worshipped, right? And he appeared, then the woman who had the child with him, right? And the child was now 22 years old, right? And the woman appeared on our equivalent of Graham Norton, but not quite as frivolous as a Graham Norton show, right? It was a chat show that's been running for 40 years. And she was on the show, and she was more or less accused of being a harlot. The presenter of the show accused her of taking down a good man. And that's the prevailing opinion of what had happened in the situation, where the exact opposite is what had happened, is this man had taken advantage of her and tried to live a double life and all these kind of things. But so she was denied even the ability to tell her version of the story, because she was immediately shamed, immediately labeled, and immediately dismissed as being someone who took down a good man, which again just highlights the danger that's inherent in the culture for women.
And I think that the word shame is so, I think two of the words that came out really loud and clear in conversations with women was shame, embarrassment, and feeling like it's their fault. And I know, as you rightly said, with Matt's example of the pulling the skirts down at school, and it's the girls' responsibility to put their cycling shorts on underneath their skirts. It's not because that's the easier route, of course. Because it's easier to tell the girls to do that rather than actually reprimand the boys, because that you've got to do every single day probably until it sets in and the habits change. Whereas if you tell the girls go and do that, then actually instantly, tomorrow they'll all rock up with their cycling shorts under their school skirts on. Most of them probably would. But you're right. There's so much around this that there's such a shift that has to happen. But I guess there's probably little things that we can do every single day. I think right at the top is we said about the anxiety, if that's the right word, about men who wanting to help but don't quite know how to. What do you think are the sort of the things that actually make the difference, small gestures that make a difference? I don't know. Over to you guys.
For me, always, Laurie, it starts with looking at yourself. It starts with being aware and noticing the language you use, notice the reaction you get when you say certain things, notice when you try and jump in and talk for a woman, or notice when somebody in a meeting or in a conversation gets shut down or ignored because they're a woman. Notice when a man gets the credit for a woman's idea. Now, what women definitely don't want is you to talk for them and you to fix anything. But actually, if you just little things like, oh, actually, I'd quite like to hear from Janet again. Or wasn't that an amazing idea from Sarah? Sarah, could you talk to more about that? And I remember when we first had Graham on here, and Graham talked about calling people in and not calling people out, right?
Yeah,
and I think there are times where there's behaviour that has to be called out. It can't fly, and you can't have, and you have to say that's not acceptable. But most of the time, the best way to do it is just be a friend, put your arm around your mate, and say, "Do you know what? I think you really upset Sarah earlier on with what you say. Did you see how she reacted when you cut her off in mid-flow there and then moved the conversation on and gave the credit to Alex? Did you see how that happened?" I think actually next time maybe just shut up, let them finish what they're saying. And I think mostly that will be well received, because most of us don't want to do that. I used to have a terrible habit of talking over women. I found it out when I got 360 leadership feedback working for the BBC. And initially it was anonymous, right? So I first found out, I was told I talked over people and I shut them down. I thought, oh God, I don't want to do that. So I decided to look at myself, right? So in meetings, I'd notice I only did it to women. I didn't do it to men. I would interrupt them. I would talk over them. I would ignore them. Now, this was never deliberate. I would never, ever deliberately be prejudiced or shut anybody down. But clearly somewhere in my psyche, there was something that told me that women's voices weren't important, that what I had to say was more important than them. And I've been retraining myself ever since. And occasionally, Laura, I still find myself doing it. A great example, right? I'm running a workshop at the moment, helping men to be better allies with a company called Upfront and this wonderful woman called Lauren Curry. We were doing a debrief after our first session when I shared that story. Guess what I did? I interrupted her.
But that it's the awareness that you did that. That's the difference. It's like if you just carried on, we're never going to be perfect. It's that learning process. And in just listening to what you've just said, and you've reminded me of another brilliant Graham phrase, which is, friends don't let friends do whatever it is. And that's what you're saying, is that quiet conversation, just calling in, going, checking out that behavior. It's like, it's just not cool. That's probably one of my young nieces.
You didn't realize what you did, because I used to do this all the time. I had no idea. So sometimes you just need to hold the mirror up and say, do you realize what you did there? Did you see the reaction that you got? Because they won't have done. And just planting that seed to make them go away and think, right, now, how can I be better?
Yeah. No, and you're right. And it is that continually, what can I do different next time? Because that clearly didn't land. I am very conscious of time, because I know you're disappearing off to go and do the training with Graham, and I have put the link in, so there's still 4 minutes if people want to register for the 7 o'clock session this evening. But look, to close this session off, because we are amazingly keeping ourselves to time tonight.
That's time for everything.
I know, absolutely.
Alarms if you said, Laura.
It's got to be a first, absolutely. I mean, they will have to look at the timing on it. Go, is there an episode? Is there a part 2 to this session? But if somebody was watching tonight and said, I want to help, but I don't know what to do, what would you say? What was one small step? One human thing that you would say to them? Mark, go on. What would you say?
Well, I think Dan did something really important just there. I think he did something really brave. He owned up. And I think that's a very good starting point for us, because to bring back the word denial, we're all in denial. We all say, oh, this has to change. People have to do better, but we have to own up ourselves. We have to own up to where we're not doing it, where we're not standing up and taking our responsibility for our own particular actions, and not aware of what we're doing, as to Dan's point, like even doing it again, not being conscious of doing it, even if we're not doing it consciously, we're doing it for a reason. We're doing it for so there's some reason in there that we're doing it for, until we become conscious of that. So I think for our own part, the beginning part is own up to what we are doing, so we can change what we're doing.
No, I like that. So we need to. I mean, we probably all need to own up. To be fair, women too, because we have to own up to being honest about how situations make us feel. Because if we're not owning up to that, then, frankly, silence never changed anything. So, we can't work with what you don't know, as I say often. So Dan, what about you? I mean, obviously, clearly, owning up is one thing.
And ask women, what can I do? How can I make you feel safer? How can I be an ally? What would you like me to do? If this, then what would you like? Don't assume that you know. Don't think that you're right, because we're really good at that as men. And when you ask that question, listen to the bloody answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Don't try to fill in the gap with what the fact that you bit your tongue to not assume, and then go and assume to the answer is. Last but by no means least, Matt, what would you add to this for those who wouldn't know where to start, or say I want to be part of this but don't know where to start?
Well, I think it's an awareness of your own reaction and feelings. I was talking to somebody earlier on today about the parent-adult-child model in transactional analysis. And, on this topic, I reflect that my reaction, if I get a response from a woman that suggests, I've made them feel unsafe or I've done something that wasn't quite right, my response is immediately go in that child and be like, well, that wasn't what I meant. It's been misinterpreted. But actually, if I can engage adult and engage the curiosity and go, so why didn't that land right? What was not quite right there? To be, and we keep coming back to this word, be curious, and ask those questions, but try and remove personal feeling and emotion. It's not about us doing wrong and feeling shame for that. It's, okay, here's a learning experience. Okay, how can we do differently next time?
No, I love that. And it's so true. It's like none of us are perfect, but unless we try, we're not going to know different. So, look, guys, as ever, thank you so much for stepping into the room. Just before you all go, I just want to share Alexandra's point. Thank you so much. Vital work, because I think that is crucial that we share that, because it is, vital that people are prepared to step into these spaces, you guys especially, and being really visible. So, and recognizing that none of us are nothing, and that is a very good place to start. So on that note, I will leave you to go join Graham for the active bystander training. I look forward to hearing all about it, and I will see you next month. Have a great evening, guys.
Cheers.
Thanks, all.
Cheers.